Listen, close your eyes for a second and picture the Sahel at dawn. Endless dust, cracked earth, villages waking under a fragile sky. For years, that landscape carried a quiet wound. Markets shuttered, schools burned, mothers counting missing children. The world labeled this place a problem to be managed. Treaties were written, troops rotated through, promises circulated in conference rooms far away. But nothing, not the speeches, not the aid packages, not the parades of foreign flags, healed the hurt. Then a voice rose from among the red earth, not polished in the capitals of Europe, but forged in the mud of the villages. A young captain who refused to accept that destiny. He looked at the maps and the money and the power and said, "Enough. This is the story of that decision. This is the story of how an alliance born of anger and prayer turned a region's fear into force. He calls himself a son of the Sahel. He calls himself a soldier. To millions, he became something more, a symbol, a leader who dared to answer the question no one else would. What if we stopped waiting for someone else to save us? The Sahel was never supposed to be a battlefield on the world's front pages. It was supposed to be home. Fields, flocks, songs. But for a long time, terror turned that home into a nightmare. Villages burned overnight. Markets emptied. Children learned fear before they learned letters. The international script was always the same. Outside intervention, peacekeeping missions, conditional aid. Those solutions arrived with cameras and glossy reports, then left, often without lasting results. Local people paid the real bill. Our story begins in the hush before dawn, in a battered command tent, when intelligence reports scroll like a countdown. Small signals, a convoy here, a text message there, that together spell catastrophe. For too long those signals arrived, and the response was slow, hamstrung, fragmented. But that morning, the stakes felt different. The men and women listening were not foreign advisors with timetables and caveats. They were farmers, mechanics, teachers who'd become soldiers. They knew the land the way you know a childhood road. They knew where shadows gathered and how to follow footprints in the dust. They called their plan something simple and fierce. We act first. We strike where they think they are safe. We cut their fuel lines, their motorcycles, their safe houses. No waiting for permission. No waiting for validation. Just precise, relentless action guided by local knowledge and fast, modern tech built by people who understood desert weather and local dialects. Imagine a grid of small reconnaissance drones, not satellites controlled by foreign powers, but machines designed, launched, and monitored by Sahelian engineers. Imagine encrypted networks carrying live feeds into command rooms in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, where officers huddle over maps and make real-time choices. That's what changed the math. Intelligence plus mobility plus unity, that formula, turned months of terror into 48 hours of surgical decisive operations. When the orders dropped, it looked like choreography. Units moved at dawn, engines growling, not in mindless charge, but in careful synchronization. Rockets and precision. Strikes neutralized mobility. Special forces isolated caches. Engineering teams disabled supply lines. By the time the sun climbed, routes that once funneled terror through the region were cut like threads. The networks that fed violence, the caches, the exchanges, the corridors, were exposed and dismantled. And something else happened that mattered just as much. The people watched. Mothers who had hidden for years began to step out. Traders returned to stalls. Students walked back into classrooms that had been shuttered. When the convoys passed through town, the cheering was not for power or glory. It was gratitude, relief, the raw human sound of a community that had been given a second chance. The world reacted the way it always does, surprised and then anxious. Analysts in distant capitals scrambled to explain how three relatively small countries had managed coordinated operations without their fingerprints on every page. Commentators muttered about outside influences, asked about hidden backers. But the truth was simpler and more radical. This victory was homegrown. It was rooted in lived experience. It was the product of military discipline and village knowledge. stitched together with modern tools. The larger shift, the one that kept diplomats up at night, was not the battlefield alone. It was the idea that a group of neighbors could look up from their fields and say, "We will defend our land together." That declaration did something the treaties had not. It made sovereignty concrete, not as a line in an agreement, but as action in the dust. Inside the camps where the soldiers regrouped, it wasn't triumphalism that you felt. It was determination. Leaders spoke quietly about reconstruction, about securing supply chains, about turning former ambush routes into trade arteries. The doctrine changed. Intelligence first, strike fast, hold together. That doctrine was taught in the barracks and in the universities. The military manuals were updated, the curriculum expanded, and the new generation learned that victory depends as much on logistics and schools as on bravery in the field. The victory at Tindiban, that desert operation that reverberated across borders, became a symbol. Not because of the explosions or the captured caches, but because it proved a thesis. Local problems can have local solutions, and local solutions can be swift, smart, and humane. People who had only ever seen foreign soldiers assume the mantle of their own guardians. That alone reshaped how citizens thought about power. Not everyone cheered. In the suites and corridors of power in old capitals, strategic anxiety turned into pressure. Sanctions whispered, diplomatic warnings circulated, narratives shifted. Old scripts reappeared, accusing the new alliance of excessive force, of instability, of the very things the region was trying to end. But there was a counter-narrative rising from markets, mosques, and classrooms. Survival, dignity, self-determination. Across the Sahel, the image of three nations standing shoulder to shoulder ignited conversations. Students in Accra debated strategies. Market sellers in Lagos argued about supply routes. Academics in Dakar wrote papers not just about military tactics, but about what it means for a region to reclaim its economic and political agency. The story moved beyond military success to the bigger promise: rebuild what was destroyed. Turn battlefields into fields of grain. Turn patrol routes into bus lines. And rebuilding is hard. The victory didn't erase years of neglect. There were towns that still needed clinics, children who needed textbooks, wells that needed fixing. So the leadership made choices. Captured intelligence was used to prevent further attacks. Resources were redirected to train local defense teams and to rebuild schools. And economic corridors were prioritized because peace without prosperity is fragile. The aim was simple and human: make it possible for a young father to plant his crops and know his children can sleep safely at night. On Far, the ground, the results were immediate and emotional. Refugees returned tentatively at first, then with greater confidence. A farmer found his plot and began to sow. Traders reopened their stalls, and the sound of commerce, haggling, laughter, the slap of hands exchanging change, returned like a small miracle. Mothers told reporters that for the first time in years they could envision a predictable harvest. Those are the quiet metrics that matter more than headlines. International reactions varied. Some countries scrambled to understand whether the success implied isolationist fervor. Others, especially nations that had long suffered under the same patterns, watched with a mixture of envy and possibility. The message, whether you agreed with the methods or not, was clear. Regions that decide to invest in their own intelligence and unity gain leverage. That leverage could be used for security, or, if mishandled, it could strain relations. It set up a geopolitical dance. But for the people in the villages who had been sleeping with one eye open, geopolitics was secondary to safety. They wanted wells, schools, roads. They wanted their sons and daughters to dream instead of flee. The leadership's answer was to anchor the military success with socio-economic programs, local job creation, vocational training, and agricultural campaigns to revive once ghost towns. They made a bet on dignity, that when people have livelihoods, they have reasons to protect their country. Stories of personal courage began to circulate. A grandmother who planted cassava for the first time in years, a teacher who walked back into a rebuilt school, a young man who signed up for vocational training instead of boarding a raft for Europe. These small arcs were the deeper proof of change. They were the human side of a strategic victory. But the leadership never mistook momentum for permanence. They acknowledged the threats, sanctions, disinformation, internal fractures. They spoke openly about the new battlefield, not only against armed groups, but against doubt and division seeded by outside forces. The task was to strengthen institutions, to hold public conversations, and to make transparency the norm so that victories could not be easily mischaracterized or reversed. And so a new chorus arose, not just commanders giving orders, but mayors, teachers, engineers, and mothers joining the dialogue. Reconstruction became a civic act. Young engineers trained on the drones now taught in local colleges. Health teams set up mobile clinics in returned villages. Traders organized cooperatives. This collective energy, harnessed by competent leadership, created a resilience that could withstand external pressure. Let's be honest, nothing about this path is guaranteed. Old powers that profited from the status quo will test the limits of the new order. There will be provocations, misinformation campaigns, and diplomatic pressure. Some will label this shift reckless, some will call it populist. Those are the expected responses when long-standing balances are disrupted. But there is a counterweight that cannot be dismissed. The social contract that forms when people see their lives improving because of policies they can touch and measure. The Tindiban operation, the 2-day blitz that cleared terror zones, will be taught in military academies. But more importantly, the months of reconstruction that followed will be studied in economics classes and community centers. The lesson is not merely about force, it's about sequencing. Secure first, then rebuild quickly and with local leadership, so the population sees real returns. That sequencing is what makes peace durable. In the end, this story is not about a single man or a single battle. It's about a decision to trust local capacity, to pair modern technology with indigenous knowledge, and to make unity a policy rather than an aspiration. It's a reminder that the tools of sovereignty, intelligence, mobility, cooperation, can be wielded by those who actually live the consequences of insecurity. If you've listened this far, you've heard a map of a larger possibility, that communities long treated as recipients of pity can, when empowered, become architects of their own safety and prosperity. That is the promise the Sahel reached for in those early, anxious mornings. They reached, and at least in Tindiban, they touched something real. So what should we take from this? Respect the power of local knowledge. Value the courage of communities who turn defense into a bridge for rebuilding. Remember that the loud noises on the global stage often miss the quieter work that holds peace together. Wells, schools, markets, and the patient work of governance. If this story moved you, if the image of ordinary people choosing to reclaim their future stirred something, then don't let it stop at a like or a click. Tell someone, ask hard questions, look beyond headlines, because the true measure of change is not what foreign policy papers say tomorrow, but whether a child in a Sahel village can sleep without fear tonight. This was a moment born from dust and determination. It was a moment when people stopped waiting and chose to build. The rest, the slow, stubborn work of making peace last, is now in their hands. And maybe, if the world listens, in ours too.